Good morning. So, good morning. Who is excited to be here today at the forum? Excellent. I think it reflects very much my own excitement about this space and time as well, which is what we're talking about with our panelists in this coming session, in this forthcoming session. Just by a very quick show of hands, who of you is holding a mobile phone right now? Great. The reason I'm asking is because, as we know, mobile phones are very much kind of our disease of the moment, and I just want us to, for the next 30 minutes, see whether we can let go of that addiction, that appendix, that third arm for a few moments, unless you want to take a nice photograph, for us really to think about the really long term. So I'm very happy and very pleased to have seen His Excellency Khalfan's introduction of what will happen in the next year, and also challenging you, what you will be doing in the year until we see one another again. And so now we're going to shift the conversation into a much longer term. But it's also a way for us, as we get into this very long term, to think about how are we in the moment and how are we more in the now, understanding that there's a lot of challenges and opportunities to be addressed and to be seized. I would say, at the most elemental, we are a mass of atoms moving through time. So our existence is space moving through time. So we're really four-dimensional beings. And what's interesting, I'm sure you know, is that our genetic code is 60% identical to that of a banana. It's also about 60% identical to that of a fruit fly, and a fruit fly lives 50 days. But what's really important for us to realize, and I'm sure you have, as I have, that what we do matters more than what a banana does or what a fruit fly does. So we have responsibility. And to quote Marcus Aurelius, is what we do in life echoes in eternity. And of course, I was picked up in the film Gladiator. So what we do in life echoes in eternity. And so that is really why today we benefit from the art, the culture, the history, the knowledge that was passed down from previous generations, and that puts us on the spot for taking responsibility what we are going to do next. And that is what we're going to do in the next 25 or 30 minutes. The session here is about time, the perception of time, how it influences us, how it influences the arts, the culture, and it's also about, as a consequence of that understanding, about being totally deliberate. And so what I mean with that is we spend a lot of time going through motions, following our habits, picking up the phone, refreshing the election results, checking WhatsApp, checking social media, etc. We're not deliberate in that moment. But what we want to make sure is, through the conversation today, which is about the very long term, that we become far more deliberate about the kind of future that we produce and the kind of actions that we take today. So I'm really pleased to have two wonderful speakers and colleagues on stage with me this morning. On my far left, Beate Hovind. She is the Chair of Trustees of the Future Library, and in conversation I have found out as well that she hails from the construction industry. The reason I mention this is because there's an element of built environment in the work that she does, and she'll tell us more about this in a moment. But she also comes from a long line of farmers, and this will become important in our conversation. And next to me is Jonathon Keats, and he is, I will pause for a moment because you will not have met anyone like Jonathon before. He's an experimental philosopher. Okay, I'll let that sink in for a moment. I think also he is one of a kind. He is the only one who does not have a mobile phone. And this is really about being deliberate about the way we live and the kinds of decisions that we make. He's also, above and beyond the fact that he doesn't have a mobile phone, he's a fellow at the Berggren Institute, he's a principal philosopher at the Earth Law Center, and he is a fellow at the Long Now Foundation. Good. With this intro, let me just really hand over to both of you, please. Anne Beate, Future Library. What is the concept and why does it matter?
Yeah. Okay, I'll try to make it short. Thank you for being here. It's amazing to see this big crowd. Future Library is an art project by Katie Patterson. She's Scottish. I'm Norwegian, and it all happens in Norway. So she had the crazy idea, and my job was to make it happen. It's good to come from the construction business, actually, when you think like that. So it's a 100-year lasting art project. We have planted a forest outside Oslo. Every year for 100 years, we are inviting an author to write a manuscript that will stay unpublished and unread until 2114. In a beautiful design room, which you have seen some images of, made out of the wood that we cut before we planted the new forest. And in 2114, it will all be published at the same time, but on paper made by the forest that is growing today.
What's the expectation?
The expectation, well, honestly, I think my expectation, I'll be dead by then, but the final result is not so interesting, honestly. I think what this project sparks of ideas and imagination, and it asking questions about how we're living, how we're thinking, about time, and a lot of other things too, nature. So I think that is my expectation is to be here, even. I feel fortunate.
We'll come back to the library. In the meantime, Jonathon, you do things like, again, stuff that people will probably not have heard. Like millennium photography, the millennium camera, the 100-year camera. Tell us a little bit more about the kind of experiments that you run for the very long term and to get people thinking about this.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and it's really delightful to be in this room. My background is in philosophy, and I fled academia because philosophy seemed too important for philosophers, at least in the academic sense. I really wanted to figure out how to do philosophy in public with everybody, and to do it in the most open-ended way, asking questions. And when I did this, I smuggled a few elements of philosophy with me, one of which is a very old one. It is the philosophical instrument. And the philosophical instrument is a way in which physically to grapple with ideas. And I started building various instruments to do this sort of work. And one that I started to, actually coincidentally, in 2014, which has a 100-year-long span to it, so 2114, mark your calendars, is going to be a banner year. I started to make cameras that have an exposure time of 100 years. And I initially did this in Berlin, which is a city that I was continually visiting and that I was finding every time that I came, it had been transformed yet again and was being transformed in ways that people who lived there didn't seem really to notice in a way that they were intentional about those changes. And so I thought, what if we were to have cameras that were surveillance cameras, but not surveillance where you're being watched over by your government or your neighbor, but instead surveillance where you're being watched over by those who are most affected by your actions, but least empowered as far as what you do, those not yet born. And so was born the project of making cameras that have an exposure time of 100 years, cameras that would be set out in the world, and we started out in Berlin with 100 of them, that are, in effect, a way in which people in the far future are able to see our actions, and that we are able potentially to see the consequences of our actions by imagining what that picture might be and by changing it to what we would want people to see. So 100 years is nice. 1,000 years, adding a zero, seemed even better, and also seemed somehow potentially to enter into what I think is an even more important realm than that of urban planning, of gentrification, of the factors that I saw happening in Berlin, all of which are very important. But the environmental dimension of what it is to be human in the world today, with the leverage that we have to change this planet for an exceedingly long time, it seemed to me that that was a dialogue that we needed to have with those who will be affected by the decisions that we make right now. Those who are not one generation, but 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 generations ahead of us, who are not even a figment of our imagination. And so I started to make cameras and setting them in places around the world, ranging from Lake Tahoe in Northern California to the Austrian Alps, and putting them out there as a sort of a provocation, but also as a sort of a time machine by which we can travel to the far future in our imagination, but remain in the present, and can change conditions in the present in a way through a dialogue with the far future that results in a future that we would want people to experience.
I'd like to pick up on 2 words, or 3 words. One is what if, and the other one is imagination. I think both projects, Anna Beate, both projects are both streams of work and thought really promote those 2 aspects. The imagining a future, positioning ourselves in the future. How have you found that you're able to convince, so to speak, authors to deposit books in your library that will not be read by anyone of their peers, anyone in their current generation, but generations yet to come? How do you manage to convince them? Is it perhaps through that lens of imagining and imagining a different world?
Well, for now we have 11 authors from all over the world, and it's been 11 years. And what they have in common is actually not the future in itself, but opening up for a hopeful future. So helping people imagine the coming futures. And I think this is where art and culture becomes really crucial in our planning, because remember, I come from the construction business, so I'm just mentioning it again, to be aware that I really think art and culture is extremely important to train and make people skilled in imagination. Because if you can imagine a future, you can also create it, right? So I think this is, all the authors until now are focusing on hope for the future, and that's why they want to be part of it, to prove that in all the uncertainties we are facing, there is hope by trusting there will be people in 100 years, there will be books even in 100 years, not only digital books.
I think these projects of 100-Year Library or the Millennium Camera, and we spoke about this before, are akin to cathedral thinking. I don't know, are you guys familiar with cathedral thinking? Some say yes, some say no. Just as an example, I looked it up. The dome in Milan took 579 years to build. And this is just one building. The Sagrada Familia in Spain is still being built after
Barcelona.
And so what is really unique about cathedral thinking is that the original architects who thought of the building at first went into that project knowing full well that they will never see it complete, number one, and number two, knowing full well that the technology that is required to complete that building does not yet exist, and yet they still went ahead. So it's a bit like the quote that we saw earlier on the screen, that the future belongs to those who can imagine it, design it, and execute it. Because if we started only from the point of view of can we execute it, can we actually build this stuff in the next 5 or 18 to 24 months, then we are constrained by what we have today. Your projects get us beyond that. And so I'm really keen to explore how that kind of thinking helps us now. Jonathon.
I think that if we are thinking about the problems of the moment, in the moment, with the context of the here and now, we are, in a sense, condemned to, or constrained at least, to think about those problems according to the constraints that brought them about, which in a sense can reify them, can only make them potentially more intractable. What is desperately needed is an outside perspective. And outside perspectives are myriad. History is one. Often if we look to the deep past, we find remarkable solutions in traditional ecological knowledge, for instance, to the problems we face today. But the future is also, I think, it has that quality, and perhaps even more so because it is indeterminate, because it is unbound by anything that we have experienced. So as a result, it is free range. It's a space we can enter into freely together in order to be able to contemplate and reflect on and to construct the present. And I think that the arts are particularly well suited to this work for a couple reasons. One of these reasons is to do with the fact that artists are without portfolio. There's a sense in which I've been able to go through life. You could say I'm a charlatan, I would probably agree, but at least as somebody who does not have any boundaries because there's no discipline I belong to. It's a state of being metadisciplinary. So I think that metadisciplinarity is something that the arts bring us. The other is materiality. The other is that the imagination is a remarkable space, but it's all that much more remarkable when we can be in a shared position as far as the act of imagining is concerned. That is one that we are co-creating. And I think that that happens through the fact that we have bodies. As you said, we're made of atoms. So this embodied self and those around us as people able to live in space and time and to make things and do things that are, in a sense, prototyping tomorrow. This is, I think, a way in which we can potentially be in the far future as far as our thinking is concerned, and yet somehow grounded or moored in the present.
Again, a couple of words. Prototyping, enter the space together, co-creating. And these are words that are very consistent with really these long-term projects, these practical utopias that we can imagine. What's been your experience with this collaborative approach that seems to be prevalent in long-term thoughts?
I think it's crucial. I think it wouldn't have happened unless we had collaborated transdisciplinary. And I think that's where the beauty in all the works are, actually. So for me, for instance, the artist has the idea, but I mentioned I had to make it happen. So I work with foresters. I work with the municipality in Oslo, which have signed a contract for 100 years. They've never done it before. And also, I come from a farm. I grew up on a farm. It's a very old farm, 14 generations. And even that knowledge I'm taking into this space. See, now I find myself in an urban context. I'm growing a forest. So I'm back in business on the farm. And I'm carrying a lot of immaterial knowledge that I thought was useless for many years. But I understand it's crucial, actually. And I really believe in practical utopias. I've done a lot of visionary work, done strategy processes, imagining visions. I'm not done with visions, but honestly, I love practical utopias because practical utopias are, for me, dreams within reach, right? So I can create them tomorrow. And I think young people that have a different time scale, understanding of time, they're too busy, you know, they want things to happen faster. I think to bring back the practical utopia thinking is very important for them to believe that they actually have influence in all the questions we are addressing.
Practical utopias speak to the sense that we can imagine something which lives in the future, which is visionary, it's a utopia out there, but it also needs to be very practical, it needs to be tangible, It needs to be something that, as you would say, Jonathon, is shovel-ready. So if you think about the long term, you've got to have something that is shovel-ready, otherwise it's just a thought exercise. How do you think about what can be learned from failure as we move through time into a very long, distant future?
Well, failure is really, I think, only possible And I feel that failure is highly generative, so I speak of failure with great affection. I think that we need much more of it in ways that we are able to learn from it. But it's only possible when we are rubbing up against reality, because the imagination has a remarkable ability to take us always to a higher or at least another plane, always to correct for whatever seemed ultimately to be a dead end, in a way that it doesn't really have the ability to probe and to interact with the world in which we live. Something that you said earlier really, I think, resonates with me in terms of working with these foresters. As I often work with bureaucrats of various kinds. Right now, I'm working with the legal department at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art as we try to figure out for a camera that will take 10 exposures over 10,000 years, the first movie camera that uses the technology that I've developed, that somehow needs to fit in with their practices, with their requirements. And this is funny, of course, or at least I find some comedic relief in it, but I think it's also a way in which to interrogate or to at least enter into conversation with the systems that we currently have and how those systems have affordances, how they have capacities that go beyond simply being able to cope with or contend with the present. And one other thing that I'll say briefly is that I think that in terms of the shovel-ready dimension, that this is, on the one hand, important because it gives grounding and therefore the capacity to do something that is potentially not the right thing to do before you've done it at scale, and therefore to learn from it and to figure out what in fact you need to be doing. That kind of failure is essential and only, I think, happens when you are working at ground level. But the other aspect of it that's important is that it's a little bit scary, a little bit frightening that it could happen, and it could happen at scale. It's imminent in a way that, while science fiction in the grand tradition is remarkable and beautiful and well worthwhile, there's something about the fact that this is a plan and it could come to pass, and we need to make decisions now that makes it so that we can actually come together as a community around these sorts of conversations.
It's really the decisions that have to be taken now, today. You're referring to decisions that really have a long time or term to play out. These are decisions for the future. I don't want anyone here to go away from this session to think that we are discussing in a very sort of ethereal and theoretical way the high importance of thinking about the next 100,000 years without really understanding or acknowledging that there are challenges and realities to be addressed today. How can we make that, how can we bridge that gap? How can we make sure that we don't fall into that fallacy of looking just into the very distant future without addressing what we need today?
But I'm so happy you're addressing that, because honestly, I'm worried. So I am extremely important about a sense of urgency. I think it's crucial to be, but I think you have to combine the sense of urgency, wanting things to happen, change to happen fast, with the long-term thinking. So I think, at least how I find why Future Library resonate with people all over the world, across borders and religion and ethnicities, I think it's because it's about basic human needs that we are in need of now. And I think this is, I think the long-term perspective is, what we need is cross-generational projects. Because I think when I grew up on a farm, my ancestors, they farmed for me, right? So we've been only 2 generations where we forgot about the long-term, not all of us, of course, but we kind of lost sense of long-term planning and cross-generational projects. So that's why I think it makes so much sense to both to really have this sense of urgency, but also to plan long-term in the future. Both.
Both.
Yeah.
Jonathon.
I fully agree. I think that triage only begets greater conditions for triage. I think that somehow we need to be able to escape the here and now, not as escapism, but as context to be able to better orient ourselves in the here and now. And honestly, that is, I mentioned science fiction earlier, that is what science fiction in some of its earliest instances was seeking to do. It was in the same way that myth does, seeking to give us context by putting us elsewhere to be able to better make sense of the here and now. We need all of that, and I think that we need all of that in a way that is cognizant of the arts being not an entertainment, though it can be highly entertaining, not frivolous or extraneous, but essential, because it is in that act of making art, of creating and experiencing together, that life is given meaning and that we have the motivation to be able to act in the present and reason to do so. This is why we need to be here. And so we need to be working within that cultural sphere as well as everything else, and to recognize that culture is a technology and technology is a culture, and that all of this ultimately coheres in a state of being that is who we are as humans.
And can I add something? We've never met before, but we're so aligned. So for me, that's why I'm here. I think we're so exhausted from this short-termism that we lose track of where we are, and we need to take timeouts like this timeout here in Dubai to reflect on what we're doing, you know. So it's both this urgency, but then take timeouts so you can actually be able to reflect together with so many different people on what's going on.
Somehow cruelly, when you're discussing hundreds and thousands of years and you've got 15 seconds left on the ticker, you know you've got to wrap up this conversation. I think, well, I hope you have appreciated, like I have, the paradox that is resolved when you think about the very long term as a means to helping address the here and now and to being more in the moment is something that can be reconciled. I would also urge you, particularly the people who are on their phones, to, when you pick up your phone, when you go through the motions, ask yourselves, am I being, you know, the 60% of my DNA that is a banana and doesn't really have an impact on future generations? Or is there a way for me to think about this shovel-ready way of thinking about the future, the practical utopia? What is my utopia? What is my community's utopia? And how can we make that happen? So I'm very grateful to both of my speakers here, Beate Hovind and Jonathon Keats. Thank you.